In the last lecture that I had with you, which was my first lecture on Walter Raleigh's The Discovery of Guyana, I had given you a very brief preview or a general theoretical framework of the contexts and conditions of the growth and intensification of British, or for that matter, European colonial ventures. In today's talk, I will be focusing more on the man in question, Sir Walter Raleigh. We will be dealing with some aspects of his biography, not exhaustively, but those aspects which are in some form or the other related to the work that we are to study for our course, the discovery of Guyana. Now, the first documented record of Walter Raleigh as some form of a public persona is traced to 1569, where we find in some documentary evidence that he fought on the French Protestant side in the wars of religion in France. Later on, we have a period of darkness, as it were, where very little authentic information about Walter Raleigh was forthcoming. And the next evidence of his role anywhere in London is concerned is his role as a student at Oriel College, Oxford, and later on, after a couple of years, as a law student at Middle Temple. That was in 1575. Again, there is a lull of 5 years in his biography, as it were, documented biography, as it were. Then we find that in 1580, he fought against the Irish rebels in Munster. And he was very outspoken in his criticism of the way English policies were implemented in Ireland. This outspokenness of Walter Raleigh and the fierce criticism that he directed against the English policies in Ireland, that brought him to the attention of Queen Elizabeth. And within a very short span of time, around 1582, he had become the favorite of the monarch. And in those days, being a favorite of the monarch would automatically entitle the favorite to have lucrative monopolies in trade, properties, lands, and influential positions in court. Queen Elizabeth very soon rewarded Walter Raleigh's Irish services by giving him vast estates in Munster. And in the very next year, that is 1583, the Queen secured him a lease of a part of Durham House in the Strand, and he was also given a monopoly of wine licenses and export of certain quality, certain types of cloth. He became the warden of the stannaries, that is the tin mines in Cornwall, and he was given the vice admiralship of Devon and Cornwall, and often sat as a member of parliament. So between the time of 1582 and 86, Walter Raleigh had a stellar rise in terms of his status and influence, largely largely because of his position as one of the favorites of Queen Elizabeth I. In 1587, in 1585, he was also knighted, and in 1587, he was rewarded with the position of the captain of the Queen's Guard, quite a formidably powerful and prestigious position in Queen Elizabeth's time. In 1592, something very critical happened in Walter Raleigh's life, which perhaps changed his sharp and profound ascendancy in power and position in the eyes of Queen Elizabeth. He acquired the manorship of Sherborne in Dorset, and quite obviously, since he had a lot of power and position and money, he wanted to settle and find a family. In this particular context, we find through several documentary evidences that he married Elizabeth Throckmorton, who was one of the members of the inner circle of Queen Elizabeth's maids. But this marriage, which occurred as early as maybe 1588 or so, was deliberately hidden from the Queen, quite obviously because Walter Raleigh and his wife, Elizabeth Throckmorton, felt that the Queen, being jealous as it is of getting the entire attention, as it were, of Walter Raleigh, might harm Walter Raleigh and his prospects because of jealousy. However, this marriage could not be hidden for long, and in 1592, the birth of a son betrayed the marriage, and quite expectedly, Queen Elizabeth imprisoned both Walter Raleigh and his wife in the Tower of London. So they were essentially imprisoned in the Tower of London for marrying. So we can assess the extent of possessiveness and jealousy that Queen Elizabeth I had vis-a-vis Walter Raleigh. However, interestingly, Walter Raleigh bought his release from the prison with profits that he made from a voyage earlier. But though he was freed from the Tower of London, he never regained his ascendancy in Queen Elizabeth's court. The child whose birth betrayed the marriage, which was held as sacred, died. Subsequently, they had two sons. But remember, in this relationship between Raleigh and Queen Elizabeth I, for around 8 years, Walter Raleigh was one of the Queen's favorites. But certainly he was not popular because, again, being a favorite of the Queen in a competitive court meant that there would be other courtiers who would be trying, out of jealousy and struggle for greater prominence and power in the court, would try and bring down the status of Walter Raleigh before the eyes of the Queen. To that extent, in 1592, Walter Raleigh became the focus of a pamphlet which was circulated, which apparently propagated atheism. And that was quite some sacrilege in Elizabethan England. Though he was the confirmed author of that pamphlet, but he was not an atheist in the modern sense of the term. And this is a very, very important criteria of atheism that will be put into focus as and when we discuss the discovery of Guyana at some depth. For Walter Raleigh, Atheism did not mean a total disbelief in God. For him, atheism meant, to put it quite simply for our easier understanding, that God is in his place and he has given abilities to man to use those abilities to the full so that his best potential can be reached. So, this form of an exercise of ability, irrespective of the role of God, was considered too progressive a thought in that time, and as a result, that pamphlet was conveniently branded as a pamphlet that propagated atheism. Nevertheless, the style of the pamphlet gives us an idea that he was interested in skeptical philosophy. He was also a serious student of mathematics, not for its own sake, but because preliminary knowledge of mathematics was a necessity for any person who was trying to be a navigator or a sailor. We have evidence that Walter Raleigh also studied chemistry in some form, in rudimentary forms, and Walter Raleigh was also a bold talker. In fact, his conviction and confidence in his talk was one of the primary reasons why he was a favorite among the whole host of courtiers in Queen Elizabeth I's court. Now, the breach in Walter Raleigh's relationship with the Queen, which was largely because of the discovery of his marriage to one of the chambermaids of Queen Elizabeth, focused essentially on Walter Raleigh's ability to use his own potential to continue his growth irrespective of the positive influence of the Queen. Between 1584 and 1589, he tried to establish a colony of some form in present day North Carolina, which he named Virginia, but he never personally visited the place. And in 1595, Walter Raleigh led an expedition to what is now Venezuela in South America, sailing up to the Orinoco River in the heart of what was then a Spanish colony. It was this expedition that is described in the book The Discovery of Guiana. Before embarking on this discovery, Walter Raleigh came across a number of Spanish documents and stories which convinced him of the existence of El Dorado, or a land of gold, and he was also informed that there was one such ruler of Manoa in that part of the world, and there was a fabulous city of gold somewhere in the interior of South America. These are the things that he heard, and these are the things which actually influenced him into embarking on that transatlantic voyage. Now, obviously, embarking on a transatlantic voyage long before any form of mechanized navigation was invented was obviously, and at its immediate level, an exercise in extreme daring, which only perhaps the most committed of navigators or explorers would embark upon. And Walter Raleigh was one of them. In that expedition to Venezuela, he did locate some gold mines, but he did not find any support from other people in favor of colonizing the area. The text that we are to study suggests that he personally felt that some form of colonization could have been made for obvious economic purpose, but he did not find favor among the other influential people who were influencing his sea voyage and expedition. In 1596, he, along with the second Earl of Essex, another influential member of Queen Elizabeth I's court, went on an unsuccessful expedition to the Spanish city of Cadiz. And in the subsequent year, he also led another expedition to the Azores. Now, in all of this, there is a requirement of an understanding of three corners of a triangle which was in existence at that time, and this triangle is essentially politico-social and politico-economic. At one end of the triangle is Spain. The other two angles of the triangle would be Walter Raleigh on one hand and the monarch on the other. Now, Walter Raleigh's aggressive policies towards Spain, and if Walter Raleigh had a total freedom of operation, he would have embarked on a battle in Spain against the Spaniards who were already colonizing that part of the world in order to dislodge the Spaniards and establish a British colony in South America. But in the meantime, since the monarchy changed from Queen Elizabeth I to King James I, remember James I became the King of England in 1603. Raleigh's aggressive policies against Spain did not recommend him to the favors of King James I for the simple reason that King James temperamentally was pacific. He did not want to embark on any war against any territory or any European power unless he was extremely provoked. And quite clearly at that point in time, King James I felt that the greatest threat that might have come to his monarchy would come from Spain. And therefore, the last thing that he had in mind was to antagonize the Spaniards by trying to dislodge Spanish colonies in other parts of the world. And it is this aggressiveness of Walter Raleigh against Spain that somehow or the other brought him into a conflict with King James I. And remember, the expedition to South America was not an expedition that lasted only a couple of weeks. In that expedition, or during that expedition, which lasted quite clearly several months, the absence of Walter Raleigh from the English court and the court intrigues meant that his erstwhile enemies or competitors in the court, they were working overtime to dislodge Walter Raleigh's position as a person of power or influence in the eyes of King James I. And very soon, as early as 1603, the year when James I ascended the English throne, some of the courtiers successfully influenced James I into making him believe that Walter Raleigh was working overtime with the enemies of James I to bring about his ruin. Whose ruin? James I's ruin. And he was trying overtime to dethrone King James the First. Now remember, those were the days where much of allegations and counter allegations and their merits were decided not with hard documentary evidence, but with general hearsays or some written statements by some person who may himself or herself be biased against one person or the other. And that written statement or document could well be used to send someone to the gallows if that someone is not occupying a position as a favorite before any power. So, quite clearly at that point in time, the same thing happened with regard to the conviction of Walter Raleigh. He was convicted with treason on the written evidence of a person called Henry Brooke. He was sentenced to death, but just before he had to be executed, he was given a reprieve or a pardon, and in 1616 he was released. But remember, he was not pardoned of the offense, which meant that he could be rearrested any time and sent to the gallows, to death. Now, in the meantime, after his release, Walter Raleigh tried his best to regain the position in the court under King James the First, and he still hoped to exploit the wealth of Venezuela. And he argued that the country has been surrendered to England by its native chiefs as early as 1595. So this was the argument that Walter Raleigh put forward in his argument before the king, that the area around Venezuela or Guiana rightfully belonged to the English, because as early as 1595, the local chieftains who were ruling over that part of South America, they surrendered the land not to the Spaniards but to the English. And therefore, he requested the king's permission to lead a second expedition there and promised to open a gold mine without offending Spain. Now remember, the only condition that King James the First put on Walter Raleigh in the second expedition was, you can do whatever you feel like, but do not offend Spain. So what happened? He went on the expedition, crossed the Atlantic, landed in South America. Most of his crew members suffered from a severe fever and other malaise, which was quite natural because they were sailing for several months across the Atlantic with little nutrition. However, after he landed, his team landed, one of his lieutenants had an encounter with some armed members in a Spanish settlement and burnt and sacked the Spanish settlement. This was against the orders of Walter Raleigh, because Walter Raleigh himself did not want that word would go back to King James the First, that the first effective work that they did was to burn a Spanish settlement in South America. But unfortunately, it could not. It might be that the Spanish settlement, the soldiers there provoked and considered these people of Walter Raleigh as enemies, and maybe they attacked Walter Raleigh's forces, and in turn they had to defend. But nevertheless, there was a skirmish, and in that skirmish, Walter Raleigh's son died in action. So remember, it's not that Walter Raleigh was directing the action from far. His son was himself involved in that unfortunate skirmish, and his son lost his life. However, the word went along, word went back to King James the First, that Walter Raleigh has he has rather went back on his word, his promise of not antagonizing the Spaniards, and he has embarked on a skirmish which has intensified England's enmity with Spain. So what happened next was very natural in the scheme of things in Elizabethan or Tudor England. Walter Raleigh's suspended death sentence that was revoked, invoked rather, and he was executed in 1618. Though the popular opinion was in favor of Raleigh, nevertheless, Walter Raleigh's position from a favorite in the court of Queen Elizabeth I to his subsequent decline and death highlights, among other things, one of the hazards of being a monarch's favorite. Since very little objective laws governed favoritism in Tudor England, and since most of the actions of the king or the queen were taken on behalf of the god, because we all know that most of them ruled, or all of them rather, ruled as representatives of God on earth. To that extent, any person who earns a favorite position by dint of any action before a king or a queen would be essentially sitting on a razor's edge, or for that matter, sitting on a tiger. The moment you fall, your fall would equate your status with death, because there is no way in which you can fly in the middle regions after a fall. You fall totally, and usually the fall would end with your life. So clearly, Walter Raleigh was one such person whose biography suggests the extreme uncertainties of a courtier's life in Tudor England. And we have so much of bloodshed, and that is why some sociology commentators tell that in the Tudor court, more people lost blood who were the closest to the power center than the enemies outside the nation. And that is indeed true, because we don't know how many. I mean, we don't have we have records of Walter Raleigh because he had a position of power and prominence, and he had that habit of recording sometimes his speeches, his letters, and he maintained these diaries of his expeditions. But there were many hundreds others who might have lost their lives because they fell out of favor of either the queen or the king, King James I. Now, this is the biographical framework which we'll have to understand before we go into the text of, the discovery of Guiana. Now, the next advice that I would be giving you in order to understand this aspect better would be to go through a book by Stephen Greenblatt, which deals with Renaissance self-fashioning. That PDF version of the book may be available, or if you cannot get it, you can knock me. I'll send you the relevant pages, which will give you an idea of the intricacies of workings in a courtier's life, a courtier who is close to the monarch. Now, in this part of in the time that I have today, I will focus essentially on theoretically matching this temperamental personality of Walter Raleigh and his biography with the colonial philosophy that existed in Tudor England. Now, as I told you in the last class, and I am repeating it today, colonization during the Elizabethan period is often viewed as something outside of, and in fact separate from, the overall European expansionism. In other words, there is something that is distinctively British in terms of colonial pursuits, as opposed to the pursuits, colonial pursuits of, let's say, Spain or Portugal or France. On the other side of the Atlantic, this colonial pursuit was seen as an expression of the British Empire that is to come, which obviously meant that a civilizing force bringing the benefits of English language, English laws, common decency and civility would be coming. So essentially, the primary philosophy of the expansionism of the British colonialism into the Western sphere, like the Americas, North or South, was that British Empire was something that is inherently good, and therefore, if these regions are colonized by the British empires, that inherent goodness or civility that was perhaps the colonial trademark of the British Empire, that would be imbibed or absorbed in the newly colonized regions. At the same time, we have to understand that there was another deep and urgent religious philosophy behind British colonization, and that was England was essentially a Protestant country. And in this context, England was perhaps the only powerful colonizing force that was Protestant, the rest being Roman Catholics. And quite clearly at that point in time, one of the primary factors which influenced English monarchs was the factor of a global, as it were, Catholic conspiracy to dislodge the predominantly Protestant England and also bring England into the Catholic fold. So in that context, and we'll be getting this evidence in this particular work that we'll study, and in this context, British attempts to colonize North America and the South America was essentially an outcome of an ideological conflict at some level between the Protestant England and the Catholic competitive colonial forces. Now remember, for Tudor England, there are three important, and this is very, very vital, this is directly relevant to our work. For Tudor England, that is the England of Walter Raleigh or Elizabeth I, colonization had three important characteristics. We'll be having evidence of all these three characteristics in the discovery of Guiana, all the three. The first is colonization was essentially a pragmatic and maybe an opportunistic response to the evolving conditions. So the idea is that the British colonizers had no other option but to colonize, because unless you colonize, you will lose even the basis or the basic core of your influence and position. So it's like it's akin to the ways and means in which an aircraft operates. The moment an aircraft leaves the ground, it either has to reach its destination or It has to land safely somewhere or it has to perish. So there is no middle path. So for them, the Britishers at that point in time, most of them felt that the position that we are having now can be easily challenged by the competing forces of Spain and Portugal if the Britishers remain silent about colonizing. So it is as if the British colonizers were forced out of Britain to embark on colonizing enterprises as a counterweight to Spain and Portugal. This is the first aspect. The second is all colonial enterprises were related to some degree of patronization. This is again very, very important in terms of why Walter Raleigh was chosen as someone, or Walter Raleigh was considered as the one who would be leading an English expedition to South America and no one else. So quite clearly, he did not sit for an exam to qualify as number one who would be leading the English charge against South America. It's not that. The entire colonial structure or edifice was built on some form of a patronization. In fact, some form of an exercise in favoritism. Since I'm in a position of power and somebody is favorite to me, I will bring in that person into a position of preeminence and give him certain powers which he will exercise on my behalf under my banner. So this is one of the very important outcomes, as it were, of British colonialism and the expansion of the British Empire. Most of the British Empire, as we know, right from the 16th, 17th, or 18th or 19th centuries, they were outcomes of favoritism, of patronization. Look at India, for example. The governor generals that were sent to govern such a huge subcontinent, did they compete with one another in an examination and get the better of the other and come? No. They all had royal blood, and it was only a means of whose royal blood is a bit more powerful at a point in time to be appointed as a governor general, let's say in India. So this entire exercise, even the exercise of the ruling of the East India Company, was closely linked to the positions of power and eminence in the British court. So this is the second aspect of military. Military considerations always played a part in colonization. Sometimes strategically, military action was meant to be staged in the to favor or to protect the colonized. Like in the Indian context, for example, we have so many Anglo-French wars. Why? Because they were all fighting with one another for the ostensible purpose of protecting the so-called interests of the Indians. Okay, but the real motive is something else. And these successful positions of English ascendancy in India, for example, was clearly an outcome of English victories over the Portuguese, over the over the French. In other words, in this part of the world, for example, clearly British military ascendancy, especially the ascendancy of the British Navy, was one of the primary reasons why India or the Indian subcontinent was ruled by Britain. Now, if we put this context in the context of Walter Raleigh's discovery of Guiana, in the context of South America, we would be seeing that when Walter Raleigh embarked on this theoretical exercise that South America could also be a colony of the Britishers, Spain was well entrenched in South America. And Spain was also a powerful Catholic force in England. And this soft power that the Spanish colonizers had over England was largely because Spain at any point in time could have destabilized politically, economically, militarily England throughout most of Queen Elizabeth's and King James's rule. Therefore, it was extremely imperative that whoever is ruling England, in this case we have two monarchs, Queen Elizabeth and James the First, they had to be extra careful about not offending the Spaniards through a conquest of some territory which is on the other side of the Atlantic, so that their own house is in some form of a disarray or is put into some form of a disarray. Remember, in all these three features, we have all these three features in Walter Raleigh, and Walter Raleigh's Discovery of Guiana is a critical text which deals with this colonizing philosophy merely because he brings in incidents which deals with all these three aspects of or characters or features of British colonialism. Now, in this context, we have to understand that most colonial enterprises were essentially economic enterprises. This is something which I told you in my last lecture as well. They were essentially economic enterprises. And in order to safeguard your economic enterprises or interests, you had to maintain a military, especially a navy in those days. And at the same time, you have to endear yourself to the colonized by peddling a philosophy which would convince them that the colonization is ultimately for their benefit. Because, as I told you, they had this aura of British superiority or British ascendancy in civilization, in laws, in mannerisms, etc. So essentially, the colonial enterprise had three components. One is a critical military component, usually a naval component. The other was an economic component, which forms the fulcrum of the whole thing. And the third is a philosophical component, whereby the effectiveness of the colonizing discourse would depend on the extent to which the colonized is convinced that the whole process of colonization was for their own benefit. Now, if you understand this in the context of India, we can understand this very well. How many thousands of Britishers did come to India as direct representatives of the East India Company to rule over us? How many? I mean, at best a few thousands at any point in time, and a few thousands ruling over several million people. How is that possible unless these millions are numbed into feeling that the thousands who are coming, a minuscule ratio, they are coming for the benefit of the locals. So it is this successful peddling of a philosophy of British ascendancy or British power or the British as a civilizing force that essentially numbed the Indian response to British colonialism for a large part of our colonial existence. Otherwise, there is no way in which we can judge, we can justify in some sense how a few thousands at any point in time, or let's say a couple of lakhs, when British paramountcy was at its highest peak, could rule over a country of several million, unless these millions are convinced that it is all for their benefit. It is only later when these millions realize that no, we are being exploited in multiple ways, that original philosophical discourse of colonialism began to crumble, and the Britishers felt that this subcontinent may not be fit for rule anymore. So essentially, the reason why Britishers ruled over such a vast expanse of the globe was because they could successfully peddle this philosophy. I mean, this philosophy is quite obviously wrong or one-sided or biased, but the philosophy of what? Of colonization as a civilizing force. That is why even today we have people in various parts of the world, which, when they are told that the Britishers took more from us than they gave us, they give us the example of our neighboring Afghanistan to tell us that, look, Afghanistan was a territory which the Britishers could never enter or colonize or civilize, and look at its position now. So this is clearly one side of the story. In other words, the other side says that in some way or the other, a colonized country pays for whatever progress that it makes during the colonial period. We, for example, we paid in millions in economic terms indirectly. The Britishers took our raw materials, processed them, sold them back to us at a huge profit. So essentially, we paid for our own, civilization, of being civilized. The railways came to India. Britishers introduced railways to India, not because the Indians could travel easily. Notice the initial railway routes. They were all economic. The considerations were all economic. So therefore, this philosophy of colonization, which is clearly challenged in post-colonial discourses, once upon a time had a primacy which numbed, as I tell you, the colonized into believing that the Britishers are a civilizing force. And it is this philosophy that is peddled very powerfully in Walter Raleigh's The Discovery of Guyana. That is, Walter Raleigh is addressing the whyness of the question: why would the locals in South America accept the Britishers as a colonizing force? Why? Because they are already ruled by the Spaniards. What is the difference that the Britishers would be bringing on the table? This is what is addressed by Walter Raleigh. So essentially, the text that we'll be doing is a text that is part geography. We'll be getting a lot of geographical details. It is part philosophy, and it is part colonial discourse.